Yeah, we're here to talk about how we can improve our critical thinking. I get pretty jazzed about this subject matter. As you guys see, as we're going to talk today, I will try not to ramble too much because I love the subject matter. This is one of my favorite things to teach. I look forward to teaching these free webinars for months and months in advance. I do this a couple times a year, and I love everything I do in my business. I'm very lucky that my work doesn't feel like work because I love what I do and I love the people I serve. I love my clients. So I'm super blessed in that way. I will say I'm especially jazzed because this subject matter is one of my favorites. I'm super passionate about it. And I love the free webinars and I love the course I teach on this subject. So I'm glad you guys are here. I'm pretty excited, and I hope that you guys get something, out of this, some real value. I'm going to try and give you some rules of thumb today that I really think could have life-changing results if you just implemented these few rules. Of course, these really are just the tip of the iceberg on what I teach on this subject, but I try to pick out a few things that are going to be super, super useful for all of us. So glad you guys are here. And before we get into the content, I do want to kind of take stock of where we are. I want to see what page we're all on. So when you guys hear the term critical thinking, honestly, what comes to mind? A free association, where you can type in, what do you think it is? How would you define it? And even how you feel about it. I always, whatever subject I teach, and I teach a lot of webinars on the law, taxes, and critical thinking. Been training on this stuff for years. And one thing I've learned in studying and teaching critical thinking is that we love to think that we are very great critical thinkers and logical decision makers, and sometimes we can be with practice, but at the same time, we are very emotional creatures. We operate based on fear and anxiety, but also love and joy and happiness, and often it's our emotions that guide our decisions, and then we can twist ourselves in logical pretzels afterward, justifying it. So what do you guys think critical thinking is, and how do you feel about it? So I see discernment, taking a moment to evaluate a situation or statement before making a decision, definitely. Looking at the question from multiple points of view and analyzing each one to come to an answer. Yeah, we do it, but we don't, definitely. Oh, good, glad you enjoy the topic. And there's no right or wrong answer on this, right? There are a lot of ways to define critical thinking. There are a lot of different perspectives on it, which is totally okay. And it's actually one of the things I love about the subject is that there are a lot of ways to define it and a lot of ways to look at it. And I tend to look at it differently from a lot of folks. Certainly the way I teach it is differently from almost anybody out there I've seen teaching the subject. So just to get an idea of just a few of the things I think of when I talk about critical thinking. And when I say critical thinking, I mean lots of things, but here's just some of the things. I mean some clarity and focus in mind. In some ways, it's kind of like a spam filter in our brain to filter through the crush of conflicting information and be able to focus on the things that are really important to us. Believing more true things and fewer false things is sort of a foundational critical thinking principle. We're all imperfect people in an imperfect world dealing with imperfect information sources. So we're going to believe some true things and we're going to believe some false things. And there are modes of thought to try and maximize the true things you believe and minimize the false things you believe. Tom and Kathleen, yeah, systematic and strategic for sure. That's part of it. And so that's what I love, seeing the different definitions out there, because quite frankly, all of them are right. The way I study and teach critical thinking, it involves a deeper understanding of your own values. It turns out that you can take a lot of these traditional critical thinking principles, logic and skepticism and similar things, and you can, with the right perspective and with compassion for yourself as an imperfect person, you can turn these principles inward and you can learn a ton about yourself and your own values from it. And then you can even wipe the slate clean and figure out what values do you want to have, what values do you choose, which is great because nobody gets to tell you what your values are, and you can go forward from there. And then, of course, it's one thing to figure out what values you want to have, but then what are you going to do about it? What are the actions you're going to take in the world? What positions are you going to take? What policies you're going to support? What are the actions you're going to take in your personal life, in your business? What decisions are you going to make? You can use these critical thinking principles to make sure that the actions you're taking are actually in alignment with the values that you choose to hold. Oh, there's another good one. The scientific method to non-science matters. Yeah, that can be part of it too. And then for me, critical thinking involves a lot of compassion for yourself and for others. It involves real empathy, trying to understand how other people think and feel, getting in their heads, not in a manipulative or weird way, but getting in their heads in the true empathetic way of trying to understand what are this person's values, how are they thinking, why are they thinking that way, what are they feeling, so you can feel what they feel and think what they think, and you can gain an incredible deeper understanding of your loved ones, your business partners, your clients, which allows for much deeper relationships, a much better ability to help each other, to work together, to find common ground. A lot of times when you use these principles to understand others better, you find out that this person, it could be a family member or a friend, and you're thinking to yourself, gosh, this is a smart, educated person, but they're saying stuff that sound crazy to me. How can they be so crazy? How can they believe that stuff? You can gain a much bigger understanding of why and how people believe the things that they do, and why and how you believe the things you do. And through that, gain a lot of common ground and be able to communicate and form relationships. And being free from the weight of our identities that are imposed on us from a very young age by parents, teachers, friends, society, can be very heavy and can really affect our critical thinking. We're actually going to talk about that a lot more in this webinar today. Again, I love the familiar faces. For those of you who worked with me before, it's a bit about my background, and I love seeing the new folks as well. It's wonderful to meet you guys and see you on here, and I hope you get a lot of value. I really try to be of service. So a little bit about my background for the new folks. Again, my name is Ian Foster. I'm an attorney. I am still a licensed attorney practicing in the state of California. I have more than 20 years experience in politics, civil service, government, private practice, done a little nonprofit work. For a number of years now, I've been in private practice, specializing full-time in educating and empowering entrepreneurs in the law, taxes, and critical thinking. And so that's my real passion. Our entrepreneurs, especially those who are really heart-centered, who really care, who have a mission in the world. And there's a lot out there to learn about law, taxes, and critical thinking. And so this is what I do all the time, is train people in this kind of stuff. I do have a lot of personal training and experience in logic and critical thinking principles. My undergraduate degrees were in engineering and political science, both of which were highly focused on sort of classic critical thinking principles. I scored in the 98th percentile on my LSAT, which was basically a day-long logic exam. And then my law school, I was very blessed to go to the University of California, Davis Law School, which is a very heart-centered law school and which teaches critical thinking from a very compassionate, heart-centered perspective. So a lot of my perspective on what I call heart-centered critical thinking, on compassionate and empathetic critical thinking, on this holistic mode of thought that combines the logic with the heartfelt compassion stuff, a lot of credit to that goes to my law school professors who instilled a lot of this in me, and I'm very grateful for that experience. My career, legal training in tax and finance, especially when I was in the government prosecuting large businesses that were violating the law, a lot of critical thinking there. And I have been very enthusiastic in my study of the subject and my evolution of how I see the subject. And I've been teaching critical thinking for a number of years. When I was with the government, I traveled the country teaching law and critical thinking to our other attorneys and auditors out there. So I've been doing this for a while. I love it, I'm passionate about it, and I'm happy to keep doing it and serving in this manner. As far as what you can expect today, we're going to talk a little bit at the beginning about why we're all prone to make critical thinking errors, or what at least we see in the modern world as critical thinking errors. And then 3 paths to improve your critical thinking. We're going to understand the difference between skepticism and cynicism. In our common language in the modern world, we often use those terms interchangeably or incorrectly. They really are different things with different meanings, as you'll see. How we can draw conclusions from better quality evidence. We are, as people, very prone to use poor arguments and poor evidence to make our decisions and draw conclusions, but we're going to give you a rule of thumb so that you can draw conclusions from better quality evidence. And how we can free our identities from our beliefs. And freeing your identity from the things you believe is a huge component, foundational to critical thinking, better decision making, forming better relationships, and really understanding who you are and what values you want to hold. And then, of course, we'll talk about my unique opportunity. It's people say it's very innovative that I teach this like nobody else does, to practice conscious critical thinking how you can practice that on a daily basis, and the sort of life-changing results that my actual clients have experienced. And so as we get into it, let's talk a little bit, just to lay a quick foundation about kind of why we're prone to making critical thinking errors. And if you kind of look back to where we came from, and I've had, you ask questions like, did our brains evolve to find objective facts? Or did our brains evolve to make good business decisions? Well, maybe yes and no, right? Our brains really evolved to survive long enough to pass on our DNA. That was their function. That was the function of all of our systems, including our brains, survive long enough to pass along our DNA. That was the goal, right? Because that's how you kept living. That's how you kept passing on, right? And so to the extent that objective facts got in the way of that, it got thrown to the wayside, or making good decisions got in the way of that, it got thrown to the wayside. It was all about survival. And so if you just think of sort of a thought of experiment, for our ancestors 100,000 years ago, a million years ago, the unknown or the unexplained was always a potential threat, right? So fear and anxiety, which are still buried deep in our brains, and a lot of us deal with fear and anxiety all the time still in the modern world, that is a survival mechanism. It was a survival mechanism as we evolved for our ancestors. And those who were more afraid often survived longer, which means we are descended from the scariest of the scaredy cats, right? And that fear and anxiety in the modern world, where not all of us are under potential physical threat all the time, maybe is not as useful in a lot of situations in the modern world. And so if you think about it, if you're walking along the savannah 100,000 years ago, and you hear a rustling in the bushes, what kind of things could it be? What are the possibilities? I mean, a ton of possibilities, but if you think you're back then, it's 100,000 years ago, it's a million years ago, you're walking along, you hear that rustling. If you want to drop it in the chat, what kind of things, what are the possible explanations for that rustling in the bushes? Any ideas? Oh, you hear my puppy dog there. A little puppy. Sophie. Hey, so there are a ton of explanations for what that rustling in the bushes could have been, right? And we have there are lions, tigers, and predators, right? Kind of like, yeah, lions, tigers, and bears, oh my, right? I actually teach a legal webinar called the Lions, Tigers, and Bears of the Legal World. An animal or God or the spiritual, right? All kinds of different stuff. And it could have been so many, there's 100 explanations, right? A little animal or a rodent, which could be totally benign or could even be a food source. Could have been the wind, could have been leaves falling, right? Or it could have been that predator, right? The lions, tigers, bears, the hostile tribesmen. But the point is, if you're walking along and you hear that rustling, how many of our ancestors stuck around to find out what it was? Did they use what we would think of as modern critical thinking principles to examine the evidence around them? Or did they get out of there? Well, as we are descended from sort of the scariest of the scaredy cats, there was a survival advantage to running and not waiting around, right? Now, 90% of the time, the explanation was perfectly benign. But if you waited around to find out what it was, that 10% of the time was something hostile or a true mortal threat. And so those that waited around didn't survive as much. And so we are descended from the ones who ran more often than not, because even though we wouldn't think of that necessarily as a good critical thinking and decision making, examining everything around you, when you're faced with mortal threat, you're going to go into survival mode and get out of there. And those are the ones we're descended from. And so in the modern world, these kind of hard instincts are not serving us that well, at least for most of us. I do want to acknowledge there are places in the modern world where there are people who are under mortal threat more often than a lot of us are, and we should recognize that and understand the blessing of those of us who are not under constant threat. And so for those of us who are not under that threat all the time, that fear response, that anxiety, that fight or flight is hampering our decision-making abilities in relationships, business, in just about every institution out there. And so let's talk a little bit about how we can start to improve our critical thinking, whatever our backgrounds and education might be in this subject. And the first one I want to talk about today is understanding the difference between skepticism and cynicism. We tend to use these terms interchangeably, and you probably heard them interchangeable. or people just throwing them around without thinking what they meant. In fact, I was just watching a news report the other day where somebody used the word skeptic when they really meant cynic, and you'll see what I mean. But really, they're very different terms. And I'm going to give you the way I define these terms, and you can look up these terms in different, various dictionaries and get different definitions. The regular colloquial dictionary, philosophy dictionaries. But I'm going to give you what I think of as very functional definitions in the critical thinking context. The way that's often defined in, in modern critical thinking teaching. Oh, that's interesting. Skepticism, wondering or doubt, cynic. Wondering versus decided is kind of a little bit like it, right? So the way I define skepticism simply means wanting to believe more truer things and fewer false things. It's just a value judgment. A value judgment in that you decide to value maximizing the true things you believe and minimizing the false things you believe. That's how I define skepticism, and that's how I use it. Whereas cynicism means a mistrust or a distrust of authority. Right? So based on how you feel about who you're hearing it from, you immediately go into trusting or not trusting. Cynicism tends to activate that more fear part of the brain, where skepticism tends to be a little more admitting what you don't know and trying to find out and learn. And let's see what we mean by that. So skepticism, again, just a choice to want to believe more true things and fewer false things, we consider to be sort of foundational, healthy critical thinking. But what does that mean in practice? How do I actually do that? Well, there are lots of ways. And there are a number of daily things you can put into practice to make sure you're being a healthy skeptic. But I'm going to give you one rule of thumb here. And that is start with I don't know as your default position. Your default position in what? In everything. In every question you're posed, every issue you look at, every claim somebody gives to you, you can start with I don't know as your default position. And I don't know doesn't mean living in a state of ignorance. It means you're saying, I don't know the answer to that. I haven't made up my mind yet. I'm not going to make up my mind yet. Somebody makes a claim to you. You don't have to immediately decide whether that claim is true or false or something else. You can sit there and say, I don't know if it's true. I don't know if it's false. And you start with that I don't know in everything. If you do that, that's going to make a huge difference in your decision making and how you see the world. And you first start to get comfortable with I don't know. And then you start to find power in saying I don't know. So I'm curious, when you guys were younger, in your youth, in your childhood, how did the adults and the other people around you react when you said the words, I don't know? Did you guys have a positive experience, a negative experience, neutral? If you guys want to let me know, how did the people around you react when you were a kid, when you said, I don't know? Beck had a more negative experience. And, think about the kind of things that might happen to kids when they say, I don't know. Maybe they get docked with bad grades in school. The other kids make fun of them. You get in trouble at home, right? You're pressured to know and find out quickly, or you're told you have to know, or you have to take a position. That happens frequently. Now, some people had, better experiences, and some people had more positive, and they're blessed and lucky. Personally, when I was a kid, I don't know was not an acceptable answer to a question. So it was drilled out of me. I couldn't say I don't know. As a teacher, you hate it when kid after kid says, I don't know. Yeah, I'm sure it can be frustrating, right? But I don't know, that empowering position, I don't know, turns out to be one of the most basic foundational principles of good, healthy, modern critical thinking. Saying I don't know, and then learning to find out. And as long as you're in this position of I don't know, you're sort of, it's kind of what I think of as up at the top of the water slide. You're up on the platform, you're looking around, you have a great view, 360 of the world around you. And as long as you're willing to say I don't know, you get to stay up there and decide what you want to do. You haven't committed to anything. It's your choice, which direction do you want to go. As soon as you think you know something, you're starting to slide down that water slide. And it can be difficult to climb back up again. Once you think you know something, if it turns out that knowledge is false, or what you thought was knowledge was false, it can be hard to undo it. If you take on a belief, it can be hard to undo that belief. And so a lot of what I teach is trying to keep the false beliefs out of your mind when you start. Tom and Kathleen, yeah, open-mindedness, exactly. Feeling power in a state of I don't know is remaining open to any number of different answers and different kinds of truths out there. And so I teach people to say, I don't know, to learn to find power in saying, I don't know. And then you take a position, you form a belief only when you see sufficient convincing evidence for the proposition. Okay, I'm convinced that thing is true, I've seen enough evidence. Or I'm convinced that proposition is false, I've seen enough evidence, right? And if you don't see enough convincing evidence, then you just stick with I don't know. And sometimes people try to ask you what will convince you. Don't fall into that trap. It's not your job to know what will convince you. In fact, you probably even don't know what will be convincing until you see it or hear it. It's their job to provide sufficient evidence to convince you. We talk a lot in my course about the burden of proof. If somebody makes a claim to you and they want you to believe it, it's their job to give you the evidence. It's not your job to disprove it or prove it for them. You're allowed to sit there and say, I don't know the answer to that. I don't believe it. I don't disbelieve it. I just don't know yet until they give you enough evidence. And so stick with that state of I don't know as long as you can. Explore, discover, and learn. Yes, I love that. And as I said, this is at least the way I teach critical thinking. And in fact, this is one thing I have in common with some other critical thinking instructors out there today. This is sort of the foundation of fundamentally sound critical thinking, is starting with that I don't know position. Now, we talked about skepticism, so what's cynicism? Cynicism is what I would call an unhealthy look at critical thinking. That picture there is a pretty cynical looking kitty cat. We have 5 little kitty cats inside and a puppy dog. Some of our kitty cats are pretty cynical. They're especially cynical about the puppy dog, as you might imagine, right? So cynicism starts with belief or disbelief before even analyzing the evidence. You hear a claim or a proposition and you immediately believe it's true or you immediately believe it's false, just based on whether it confirms your priors, whether it conflicts with your priors, whether it's something you want to hear or don't want to hear, based on your level of trust of the person who's saying it. It's immediate belief or disbelief. It's not starting with I don't know. In fact, it tends to activate more of the fear center of our brain, the anxiety center of our brain, the feeling that I have to take a position or I have to know, because if I don't know, that means I'm ignorant or foolish or people are going to make fun of me or pressure me or whatever it might be. And so cynicism then tends to lead to a lot of assumptions, a lot of incorrect conclusions, and a lot of poor communication. Ends up having us talk past each other and have a difficult time communicating. So again, skepticism and cynicism are not the same thing, right? Use skepticism if you care about whether your beliefs are true. Skepticism meaning, I don't know, I'm not going to take a position yet. I'm going to wait for the arguments and evidence. And I don't even have to know in advance what's going to convince me before I see it. Interesting, yeah, Tom and Kathleen. Cynicism can be that, yeah. And don't be afraid to say, I don't know, right? In fact, you get to stick with I don't know as long as you want. People don't get to tell you, they can't make you take a position. They will try to pressure you, right? And especially in modern society, you see a lot of this, you're either with me or against me stuff, right? If you're not with me, you're against me. That's trying to force you out of I don't know and taking a position. Or, hey, convince me that I'm wrong. You'll see people say that in some of these memes. I believe this, convince me I'm wrong. They're trying to pass off a burden of proof to you. They're trying to get you to take on their job for them. They're trying to get you, force you out of a position that I don't know. Don't let them do that. Don't give up your power and your ability to make up your own mind on your own time based on what you see. So then at some point, you may draw conclusions, you may form a belief, and a belief, the way I teach it, is nothing more than being convinced that something is true or being convinced it's false. A belief is just something you're convinced of, right? So you tend to draw a conclusion or form a belief based on the arguments and evidence you see around you. Well, a lot of us do it based on poor quality evidence, and we don't realize that that's what we're doing. But I want to give you one way to draw better conclusions based on better evidence. We're going to talk about one rule of thumb. This one rule of thumb, if you implement it consciously on a daily basis, can make a huge difference in how you analyze the world around you. For ordinary claims, it's okay to look at ordinary evidence. And for extraordinary claims, demand extraordinary evidence. So what do we mean by that, right? Well, let's say I'm going to make the following claim to you. I'm going to assert this claim is true. I have a new puppy at home. If I come to you and make that claim and I want you to believe it, am I making an ordinary claim or an extraordinary claim? What do you guys think? Is that ordinary or extraordinary? Yeah, ordinary, right? We're probably always seeing that as a pretty ordinary claim. It could depend on who you are. It definitely can, for sure. For most people, most of the time, this is going to be an ordinary claim. Now, what makes this an ordinary claim? Because it's consistent with our everyday experience of our shared reality around us. It's entirely consistent with the things we experience all the time. We know that dogs are a real thing. We know that young dogs are called puppies. We know that lots of people like to have puppies at home and make them part of their family, right? Those of you that know me know that my wife and I love animals. It would not be at all surprising to hear that we got a puppy, right? So that's what makes this a more ordinary claim, which means you might be able to look at ordinary evidence, right? You don't, even with a claim this ordinary, you don't have to believe me right away. You can say, I don't know if that's true or false. But what kind of evidence would be acceptable to you to convince you that this claim is true? What would you want to see from me if I want to prove this claim is true to you? Sure, a photo. Photo might do it. What other kind of evidence? Yep, the dog. So holding her up in front of the camera, which I would do, except she has finally worn herself out and gone to sleep. And if I wake her up, it's going to be lots of fun, right? So for this kind of ordinary evidence or claim, there's nothing wrong with looking at perfectly ordinary evidence for it. Beck, yeah, my excitement, right? Getting excited about the puppy. That's a good one too, which is kind of akin to my personal testimony. So I'm testifying to you personally, yes, we have a puppy at the house. In fact, a few minutes ago, some of you may have heard the puppy barking as she got excited when one of the kitties came downstairs. Maybe my neighbor's testimony. My neighbors have met the new puppy, right? Pictures, video, right? Maybe chew marks on the furniture. Got a puppy at home, still working on that chew mark stuff, right? Trying to get her to chomp on her toys, not on the stuff we don't want her ruining, still training her. This would all be super ordinary evidence. Indeed, personal testimony would be the most possible ordinary evidence there is. It doesn't get any more ordinary than personal testimony. There is personal testimony for almost every claim out there, whether true or not. There are people willing to testify to it personally. So it's okay to look at this kind of ordinary evidence to be convinced that this ordinary claim is true. Now, why is that? Because if it turns out the claim is not true and you've been fooled into believing it and it's false, it doesn't really damage your critical thinking ability. It doesn't really say anything about your greater critical thinking ability. For one thing, the claim is much more likely to be true, precisely because it's so ordinary, it's likely to be true. And if it turns out it's not true, that means I was lying about something stupid and absurd. And if I'm lying about this, that says a whole lot more about me than it does about you. It doesn't really show that you're making any critical thinking errors, right? It doesn't make you more likely to believe lots of false things out there. Now, on the other hand, I'm going to make another claim to you now. There's a real life dinosaur on the loose, right? So the closest city I live to nearby is Reno, right? So yesterday I was in Reno and there was a real honest to goodness dinosaur rampaging in downtown Reno, smashing the windows in the casinos, chewing up the cars, eating the people, okay? Ordinary claim or an extraordinary claim? What do you guys think? Yeah, Tom and Kathleen, you can prioritize this stuff, right? You only have so much energy. You can't analyze every statement and claim you hear, right? So it's perfectly acceptable to keep suspending judgment if it's not important to you. And if it matters, then look into it. So yeah, seems, we seem to agree this is a fairly extraordinary claim. What makes this so extraordinary? And this would be on the pretty extreme side of extraordinary, to the point where a lot of us would almost go to the cynical thing of, that can't be possible, it's not possibly true no matter what you show me, which would actually be a cynical response to it. But this is extraordinary because it is outside of our everyday experience of our shared reality. right? As far as we know in our everyday experience of shared reality, there are not dinosaurs rampaging around American cities causing havoc. That's not something we tend to see. So this would be pretty extraordinary. So if this is extraordinary, what sort of evidence would you want to see? If I am to convince you that this claim is true, what would you need to see? I'm assuming that my personal testimony in a photograph is no longer going to be good enough, right? What kind of evidence would you guys need to see to be convinced this is true? Be there live, news footage, newspaper, news on TV. All right, so you're going to start to need to see more, right? Some credible stuff. So you might want to see, say, video from multiple angles and credible sources. So lots of video on lots of news stations, right? Lots of news feeds, maybe some live streaming feeds as it's happening. Lots of eyewitness testimony, maybe even under oath. Maybe you need to be there personally. Maybe you need to go to downtown Reno and look at the damage yourself, right? And maybe even something, you know, really solid, like a bunch of scientists captured the dinosaur, they took physical samples, and all these paleontologists analyzed the DNA of the dinosaur and confirmed that, yes, indeed, oh my gosh, that matches the DNA of a real dinosaur, right? So you need to see a lot. Yeah, the dead dino, after they stop it, right? Maybe they don't need to kill it. Maybe we can keep it alive. But I imagine it might need some force to stop it. But again, we're talking about like the actual physical samples, right? Being analyzed by qualified people. So you're going to need to see a lot more. And the reason you want more extraordinary evidence here is because an extraordinary claim is more likely to be false because it's so outside of our everyday experience. And if you start believing extraordinary claims based on very ordinary evidence, that does mean that your mode of thought is such that you are going to believe a lot of false things. You're going to be fooled by false claims if you're accepting ordinary evidence to demonstrate them. So basically, the nature of the evidence should match the nature of the claim. The more extraordinary the claim, the more extraordinary the evidence should be also. And this is a spectrum, right? It is not a bright line. It's not as though you start with ordinary over here and then it hits a line and suddenly it's extraordinary. No. The more outside of our experience it is, the more extraordinary it gets. Along that spectrum, the more extraordinary the evidence you want to see. The nature of the evidence should match the nature of the claim. And don't be afraid to say, I don't know. Yes, Tom and Kathleen, credibility is actually part of it. And actually in my course, we go through a lot about how you analyze arguments and evidence. Credibility is definitely one of the things we touch on there. Credibility, relevance, structure, all kinds of different things. But don't be afraid to say, I don't know. Even if it's an ordinary claim, even if I'm just telling you I have a puppy at home, you are not required to be convinced of that just based on my testimony, just because it's ordinary. You can always suspend judgment and wait. So now I kind of teased this subject earlier, and I'd like to get into it a little bit deeper. This notion of beliefs and identity, and how we tend to let our beliefs define our identities, which tends, what I mean by that is, beliefs, again, are just things we're convinced of. You're convinced X is true. You're convinced Y is false. Those are just beliefs. You're just convinced of them. But those beliefs aren't who you are. They're just things you're convinced of, and they don't have to be who you are, and they don't have to define who you are as a person. But we tend to let them define who we are as a person. Why do we do that? Because as kids, it's drilled into us. And this goes way back again to, you know, our ancestors and tribal identities. Tribal identities were a survival mechanism, right? And we still have tribal identities today, don't we, in our society? Tribalization, polarization. A lot of people tend to agree that these are big problems in society right now. That's just another way of saying that we're all running around letting our beliefs identify us. Our identities are wrapped up in our beliefs, and then we tend to get wrapped up in tribes with similar beliefs, and this becomes an identity issue. So here's the kind of problems it creates. If your beliefs become who you are, if your beliefs become your identity, then when a belief is being challenged, your subconscious mind takes it as an attack on your person. Because it's no longer just a challenge to something you're convinced of. It's not just somebody saying, hey, I'm not sure that's true, or I'm not sure that's false. If that belief is who you are, that somebody is now challenging who you are. They're challenging your identity. right? And what happens when we feel attacked or threatened? Where does our mind go as creatures when we feel attacked or threatened? What do you guys think? What are some of the traditional responses to being attacked or threatened? Yeah, fight or flight, defensive mode. Sometimes it's called fight, flight, or freeze, right? But that's sort of immediate defense, fight, flight. So kind of fight or flight or freeze. And imagine how being in fight or flight, how when your mind goes into fight or flight or freeze, that's not great for your decision-making and your critical thinking, right? It starts to take away your ability to analyze. It takes away your objectivity. Now, if you're about to cross a busy street and you hear a loud diesel engine, go ahead and go into fight or flight. It's going to save your life. If you're walking down a dark alley and somebody comes out with a knife, go ahead and go into fight or flight. That's going to save your life. But when you're not under mortal physical threat, fight or flight is damaging our decision-making abilities. Think about it this way. If you go into fight mode, you're going to fight for that belief. Somebody comes along and says, that thing you believe, I'm not so sure it's true. I'd like to talk about it. No, they're not just having a rational discussion with you because you identify with that belief. They're now attacking who you are, right? So you're going to fight for that belief. You'll grab onto any reason to justify that belief. It doesn't matter how bad the reason is or how false the belief you hold. You will twist yourself into logical pretzels. This is how you get some of the smartest people who are well-educated, trained in logic, trained in critical thinking. This is how you get those folks believing things that are obviously false because it's an identity issue, it's a tribal issue. And when you know a lot about critical thinking, you also know how to misuse critical thinking principles to twist yourself into pretzels to justify your identity. You'll fight for it. Maybe you go into flight mode or freeze mode, right? So in that case, you're going to ignore the evidence that contradicts your belief. It doesn't matter what your belief is. It doesn't matter how strong that evidence is. It could be incredibly strong, verifiable, relevant, credible evidence based on a strong argument structure. Your subconscious mind will not let you hear it. It goes in and out. You can't hear it because you're in flight mode, because you're not just having a rational discussion about whether something is true or false. You're now under attack because you identify with that belief. So you can't hear the counter arguments. Oh, you're very welcome, Tom and Kathleen. Again, the more polarized society is, the more I've been trying to reach out and teach this for sure. So let's look at, again, the difference between identity and belief. It can be sometimes hard to figure out what I mean. So like when I say a belief is something you're convinced is true, but identity is who you are. Let's look at a couple examples to try and demonstrate, right? Here's a belief statement. I agree with most of the policies of the Federalist Party. It's framed more as a belief, okay? So back in the beginning of the United States history, we had a political party called the Federalist Party, right? So if let's say there was still a Federalist Party where you live and you said you agree with most of the policies of the Federalist Party, that's more of a belief statement. You look at the policies that party advances and you're like, I'm convinced that one's good, maybe this one's bad, but most of them are good, right? On the other hand, let's look at the identity statement. I am a Federalist. Do you guys feel the difference between those statements? Which statement is heavier in your mind? Which statement is weightier? Yeah, the second one, identity. Yeah, you guys definitely see that, right? That I am a Federalist suddenly is very weighty. And now think, if you're standing there saying I am a Federalist and somebody comes along and says, hey, the Federalist Party advanced a new policy yesterday. I don't like it. Let's talk about it. You can't talk about it because they're attacking you. They're attacking your identity. Now, they're not attacking you or your identity, but your subconscious mind takes it as an attack on your identity. On the other, another way is, let's say there's a Federalist politician that proposes a new piece of legislation. You might go immediately to, yes, that's a great idea. Why? Because they're part of my tribe. because I identify with them and they identify with me. So I immediately agree with that person is proposing. And I immediately disagree with what the other party is proposing. And now you see how if you're saying I am a Federalist and the other person is saying I am a progressive or I am a Democrat or I am whatever it might be, now you can't talk. You can't find common ground because now you have identities under attack. Now you're screaming at each other, right? Now relationships are ruined. You can't talk to each other. You can't find common ground because of these identity statements. Let's try another one. Here's something that's framed more as a belief statement. I think equality is better for society, right? So maybe because of your values and your beliefs, you're generally convinced that proposals to increase equality is better for society. Now let's look at the identity statement. I am an equality activist. You guys feel the difference? Which one of those is heavier? Which one of those statements carries more weight? Yeah, the second one, you guys see that? Especially when you start throwing in words like activist and warrior to add on, to qualify the identity statement, to emphasize that this is your identity. Now, all of a sudden, the Federalist and the equality activist, let's say the Federalist Party proposes something the equality activist doesn't like, they can't talk because they each feel like their identities are under attack and there's no common ground, there's no discussion to be had. It's just a fight. So what do? Well, a lot of this takes some internal work. I'm not going to lie to you guys. It's not easy, right? Because these identities are pushed on it from a very young age, and it's hard to get out from underneath them. It can be done. I'm proof of that, and my clients are proof of that, right? Now, I'm not perfect. My clients are not perfect. Even we still use identity statements. It can be tricky. But one way to try and start to get out from the weight of your identities, to keep yourself more open-minded, to having discussions, to changing your mind based on new arguments and evidence, is to watch the language you use. Watch the language you use verbally when you speak to other people, and watch the language you use in your internal monologue, right? Watch your language patterns. In fact, in my course, we talk about language patterns and how they affect our thinking. So try to stick to statements like, I agree with this thing, I believe in this thing, I think this, I accept this. You can even go something like, I'm convinced this is true, or I'm convinced this is false, at least for now, right? And try to stay away from or be more careful about statements like, I am and I belong to. You guys see the difference between the belief statements? If you're using the belief statements, it's a little easier, not always easy, right? Because even once you just believe or can be convinced of something, it can be difficult to become unconvinced, but you can also still remain open to unlearning the thing you believed in, to being unconvinced of it. But as soon as you go to the identity statement, it becomes much, much more difficult. Not impossible, but very, very hard to get out from under it and change your mind, right? Now, a quick word, a lot of things I get asked are, what are label statements, things that are definitionally true. So you can say, I am a blank, and it might be definitionally true. For example, I am an attorney. I can say that, I am an attorney. That is just a definitionally true label. I have a law degree, I have a law license, I have a private legal practice where I actually give people real life legal services. I am an attorney. That's just true by definition, okay? On the other hand, I may say, man, I am an attorney with all the baggage and weight that comes with it and everything I want to drag in about what it means to be an attorney and about who I am. So even that, you can say something that's definitionally true, but you can still cross a line into making it an identity statement that can pull a lot of weight with it and a lot of baggage in with it as well. It is full of meaning and emotion. You're absolutely right, which is why it's so hard when you get all that meaning and emotion behind it. You know, and there can be very positive rewards for that meaning and emotion. It can put you in community with people. It can make you feel good. It can give you some purpose. At the same time, it makes it very difficult to change your mind on anything, precisely because of all the emotion behind it. There's always a balance here. Like I said up front, we are emotional decision makers, and we have to recognize that in order to make better decisions. And I'm not saying we take all the emotion out of decisions. In fact, I talk a lot in my course about the compassion and the empathy and the love about the emotional component of decision-making and critical thinking. Yes, Tom and Kathleen, you're right. Careful about choosing your words. I try to be careful with mine. I still make mistakes all the time, and I've been making this a daily conscious practice for decades. It's easy to still make these mistakes precisely because this stuff is so ingrained, right? And so you catch yourself making a mistake, you fall down and you get up. You fall down and you get up. You just keep trying to do better next time. So again, confusing beliefs and identity is, in my mind, one of the more pernicious and tricky critical thinking errors because it's so ingrained in us, okay? As long as you believe something, you might be open to changing and improving. But if you are something, you remain stuck. And it becomes much more difficult to learn and grow and improve who you are. Tom, that's funny. That's very good. Very good. Is that definitionally true or is it an identity, right? If it's definitionally true, maybe. If it's an identity, and this is where it gets interesting, because I've had people say, well, my identity is that I'm open-minded. Why can't I stay that? If your identity is that you're open-minded, then you are never not open-minded. Then you are not open to criticism of your open-mindedness, right? So that's a good example. So what have we talked about and learned today? Well, healthy skepticism, right? Foundational critical thinking is learning to love to say, I don't know, and waiting for convincing evidence. And you don't even have to know what that convincing evidence will be. You'll know it when you see it. That's how being convinced works. It trips an unseen wire in your head. You'll know it when you see it. And you get to wait as long as you want. Looking at the quality of evidence. The more extraordinary the claim, the more along that spectrum to extraordinary, the more extraordinary evidence you should demand. That rule of thumb is going to make a huge difference in your decision making. And then being careful about beliefs and identity. If you let your beliefs define you, it becomes easy to get stuck and hard to move on. Hard to change your mind, hard to have conversations, especially hard to have conversations with people with conflicting identities. Right? Or identities that incorporate different sets of beliefs. You end up butting heads and not communicating at all. And again, that polarization, that tribalization gets in the way of our religion, our spirituality, our politics, our businesses, our family relationships, our households, everything. So why should you keep learning and practicing these principles? Again, as I said, what I've talked about today is really just the tip of the iceberg of what I teach in terms of critical thinking. These are just a few of the foundational things. I can't give you everything in a 1 hour, webinar, or hour and a half, or whatever we're doing here, right? What are the real life benefits? Why should you keep going and keep learning this stuff and practicing, right? And keep in mind, one reason to keep growing and practicing is because critical thinking is not like riding a bike. It is not something you learn once and you're done. Critical thinking is a constantly evolving skill set, and it erodes if you don't keep learning and practicing it. You have to make it a conscious daily effort to get the full weight and benefit of critical thinking. So some real life benefits. The way I see it, a much deeper confidence and understanding of yourself. I use critical thinking principles, and the way I teach them, we turn them inward with compassion for ourselves as imperfect people to peel back the layers and figure out what our real true values are. You can get a great deal of self-awareness from these tools that I teach. A lot of folks take my course, come in thinking they have one set of values, and they leave realizing they had another set of values they didn't realize. And then the great thing too is you get to wipe the slate clean because nobody gets to tell you what values to hold. That is your subjective decision. That's your personal choice as a free actor, right? You get to choose what values you want. So you get to wipe the slate clean and decide what values do I want to advance in the world as a person. That's your choice. I don't get to tell you, nobody gets to tell you what values to hold. And then of course, once you know what these values are, how do you take action that aligns with them? How do you actually take a principled stance that aligns with those values and really advances them? Again, you can use the critical thinking tools to analyze the actions you're taking in comparison with your values and see if they're really advancing the values you hold or not. Often we find out the actions we're taking are not as in alignment, and feeling out of alignment, out of balance is not great. Sometimes that out of balance, out of alignment feeling that a lot of healers are working on, a lot of it has to do with actions in my mind, not always, but it can have to do with actions that are not in alignment with your values. Feeling in alignment is a great feeling to have. And so who do you want to be in the world? And what impact do you want to have in the world? Again, that's your choice, and you get to do what you want about it. Gaining a deeper understanding of others. Again, so I also talk about how to use these principles with compassion for your loved ones and your colleagues, feeling that empathy for them, so you can really understand how they think and feel in a non-judgmental way. And the point is not to have an agenda talking to other people. The point is not to use critical thinking tools to hammer them and convince them. The point is to understand them better. Because trying to hammer people and convince people with logic and critical thinking, how well does that go most of the time? Not so well, right? But when you speak to people with compassion, when you're empathetic, when you're genuinely trying to understand them because you care about them and want to understand them, it goes much, much better. And you can start to figure out a common way to look at the world, a common way to accomplish things in the world. Communicating deliberately and effectively. In fact, a couple of you mentioned today talking about choosing your words carefully, right? Using your words to great effect. Make sure you use the right words at the right time. Use them only when they're going to have a great effect. Don't waste your words when you don't have to. Listening. Right? So not only speaking, communicating your words, but listening to other people's words and doing it with real purpose and compassion. We're going to talk about in my course, methods of questioning people and listening to people that help you understand them in a way that forms a deeper relationship. Non-judgmental, non-critical ways to ask people questions and listen to their answers so that people will trust you, feel good around you, and want to open up. Again, not so that you can go to them with an agenda and hammer them over the head with critical thinking, but so that you can learn about them. These are living human beings. Have compassion for them and what they think and how they came to their positions. Try to understand them. That's how you deepen relationships and find common ground so you can actually work together. And having a stronger and more effective business. Better decision-making skills just in general is great for business, right? It's going to strengthen your business. It's going to strengthen how the work you do in the world. And that positive influence you want to have in the world is much easier when you're making better decisions. That's good, Tom. Yeah. And I love that. Alignment and attunement expand with amplification. I agree. It's a bit of a feedback loop in a positive way, right? Sort of a positive feedback loop. I love that. So my program is called Life's Problems Made Easy, Awaken Your Genius Through Critical Thinking. Kind of a funny name for a course, I know. I used to call this course other things, but after running it a few times, I started to ask the clients who've been through it, what did they get out of it? What are the benefits? What are the transformation? And one thing I heard over and over, what is it? This mode of thought that I teach, it just made all my life's problems that much easier to look at, right? We can't solve all your life's problems. I can't make everything go away. But we can work on a mode of thought that just makes everything that little bit easier, that gives you a perspective on everything. So we ended up calling the course this. It's a 6-week group program, and we have a number of goals at the end of the 6 weeks. A handful of them is rewiring your brain for sound, foundational critical thinking, good critical thinking, better decision making. You do have to rewire your brain, right? Like anything else you learn, like any other subject, it requires daily practice to get your brain to start thinking that way. But it can happen with daily work. You can form the new habits. The new modes of thought can become a habit in your brain. And again, it's not like riding a bike. This skill will erode if not practiced. And you need to keep practicing it, keep learning it, keep evolving it. I've been teaching this subject for years, and my critical thinking is still constantly evolving as I keep listening to other critical thinkers and keep getting their perspective and keep incorporating the new things I learn. I'm a big believer that we all have this inner genius in us. And a lot of us, when we were kids, this inner genius was stuffed down, especially if you're someone who had unique perspectives, you know, especially if you're a creative type, especially if you didn't conform, right? These inner geniuses were stuffed down inside us as kids. I want you to bring it out of hiding. And these critical thinking principles, the way I teach it, does that. I don't want us to be victims of the media and information ecosystem that is not designed with our best interest at heart. There's a lot of media information out there going along, a lot of different sources, a lot of different perspectives. None of it was designed with your best interest in helping you make aligned decisions. Improving communication, how we communicate, how we listen in our business, in our relationships, politics, whatever it might be, and discovering again how to have more influence in those real deeper relationships. So we do this through 20 bite-sized learning modules. So some people's programs have sort of fewer modules that are longer. I tend to have more modules, but keep them in short bite-sized chunks, organize them logically so you can get in, learn the one thing, go on to the next one when you're ready, right? So just some of the stuff we're going to talk about, the difference between truth, belief, and faith. What are these concepts? Why do they matter? How do you incorporate them into your critical thinking? What is proper, healthy skepticism? And how do you not let false beliefs infiltrate your mind in the first place? Once a false belief infiltrates your mind, it can be very difficult to root it out again. So we talk a lot about the quality of arguments and evidence and how to make sure these things don't infiltrate your mind. Foundational principles of logic like identity, non-contradiction, validity, soundness, a lot of more traditional logical terms, logical structures, what makes the argument work, logical fallacies or mistakes that destroy arguments, right? So this is where we do some of the more traditional critical thinking, but I do not teach this as hard, cold math logic. I teach it with real life discussions and examples. I try to make it interesting and fun and very practical, something you can actually implement in what you're doing. And we get together in the discussions and work on that stuff together. So we also talk about what poor and bad faith arguments look like, how you can avoid making them, how you can avoid believing them yourself, right? How to examine your own values. As we talked about, what are your values and how do you be in alignment with them? How do we combine these logic and critical thinking principles with the compassion and the empathy to better understand our loved ones and the people around us, and using our words to greater effect to have that influence that we want to have? So I get often asked, how is my instruction different from other courses on critical thinking? I'm told that mine is very different and like no other out there. Basically, I teach critical thinking as a self-improvement tool, as a relationship building tool. This is not just cold, hard mathematical logic and skepticism. This is about introspection. This is about learning about yourself and learning about the others around you. I recognize that logic and critical thinking are not the only source of truth. There are some teachers out there who talk about logic and critical thinking as though it's the only way to find truth. I personally disagree. I think that critical thinking is one very powerful pathway to truth, but not necessarily the only one. And also there are lots of different kinds of truth out there. I teach critical thinking ultimately like an art form. So if you go to the museum and see a beautiful painting, is it the painter's job to hand you all the answers on a silver platter? Is it the painter's job to just spoon feed you all the answers? Personally, I think it's the painter's job to pose questions and help you pose more questions and seek your own answers. That to me is what art is in many forms. And so that's how I teach critical thinking, posing questions and giving you the tools to keep posing questions and keep finding your own answers. I'm not here to solve your problems or give you all the answers. I teach a lot of effective communication, right? For deepening relationships. How do you talk? How do you listen? Effective communication is a huge part of the course. And I really try to keep my own agendas and biases out of it. I am an imperfect person. I still have biases. I still look at the world through a lens just like anybody else. I do work hard to put that aside, right? I do work hard not to have an agenda. And my only real conscious agenda in the course is to empower you to take empowered action based on your values. I know this is a lot to chew on, and so we don't just throw you in the deep end and let you sink or swim in the course. We try to give you a lot of access, right? So you do get the videos, you get the slides, there are a lot of worksheets, exercises, quizzes to help you absorb the information, and incredibly important are the weekly live Q&A calls. The live Q&A calls are going to highlight important instructional points, but they're also going to have a ton of Q&A time, plenty of coaching. I try to stay on these calls as long as possible, as long as it's needed. My theory is if you have questions, I want to make sure they're answered. If that means I have to stay on a little bit longer, then I have to stay on a little bit longer, right? I want to make sure everybody's questions get answered. And we work hard at forming community on the course. I tend to put out a pretty good energy out there. I tend to attract people who are very caring, kind people, great folks, heart-centered, service-oriented, and they may have different values and perspectives, which is great because I want to hear all the different values and perspectives. And this on these calls is where you get to share your values and perspective and hear other people's values and perspectives in a non-judgmental manner so that we can all understand each other better and work through this stuff together. So we really try to form a great community. I have seen friendships formed in this course. I've seen business relationships made. I've seen marriages repaired in this course because of the community and the compassion and love that we do together. The next program is getting ready to start pretty soon. If you enroll today, you get instant access to all the online instructional content. All the instructional content is uploaded already. There are already people on there going through it. I can see them making their way through it. I do that because some folks are go-getters and want to get into it. So I give it all to you right away, instant access to everything, and you get to decide your own pace, how you want to go through it. We will have at least 6 live Q&A calls. It's a 6-week program, so we'll have at least 1 call per week. The calls are going to start later next week. And so there will be at least 6 of them. There might be more calls, bonus calls at different times, depending on how many people enroll and what for different time zones. The more people enroll who at different time zones, the more I'm able to do different calls and bonus calls at different times. What's the value of the course? Well, for those of you that like to think in terms of the math and the dollar value, my current off-the-shelf rate for one-on-one work is $600 an hour. That is not some fake inflated rate. That's what real people pay me in real life. And most of my programs cost $2,000 or more. Again, that's a real life rate that people are paying all the time for my programs, right? But if you ask my clients who have been through this program, it's literally priceless. Thinking of it in that monetary terms is not the quite right way to do it. They have found it priceless. And you don't have to believe me, right? In fact, if you're a good skeptical thinker, you'll start with, I don't know, and you won't believe me right away. You'll ask for evidence. That's good foundational skeptical thinking. So the best evidence I can give you is a testimonial from my clients who have been through it. So Amy in New South Wales. Ian's course transformed my marriage and parenting. Ian only charges once for household access, so we watch the content as a family. My kids are now empowered to make their own decisions and form their own opinions without relying on myself or others. My husband and I now communicate on a much more compassionate level and a better way of understanding one another. Ruth in Switzerland. Enthralling content, excellently presented, builds in bite-sized, easy to follow, thought-provoking sections to an impactful conclusion, challenging everyday thinking and behavior, and expanding the logical mind. Ian is a skillful facilitator and a great observer who never misses a beat in validating everyone's contributions, enthusiastically making the weekly interactive calls a fun, lively, and not to be missed event. And I do try very hard, again, to create that community. I want to hear everyone's perspective. I think everyone has a valuable contribution to make to that community and learning from each other. And so I love to hear all the perspectives everyone brings in. Mark in Italy. The modules are fantastic. Ian's approach to blending the heartfelt with the hard logic is phenomenally useful and promising for personal and societal growth. So if you want to think about the value of the course, what is it worth to have a single mode of thought? Because we combine the traditional critical thinking principles with that compassion, that loving empathy to make a holistic mode of thought that you can apply to any issue in life. What's it worth to feel powerful as you say, I don't know, and feel confident as you say, I don't know, and not feel any pressure to take a position or form a belief until you're ready to? What's it worth to understand what should be convincing and what not? So you know how to filter out this crush of information. Again, this ecosystem is not designed with your best interests in mind. What's it worth to make better decisions in business that then enabled you to have a bigger influence on the world? What's it worth to understand yourself, to dig deep inside and think, what are my true values? What values do I have and how do I take action that's aligned with them? What's that worth? What's it worth to deepen the relationships, including repairing relationships, whether it be spouses, children, loved ones, colleagues, clients, you name it. You know, think of that person in your life who maybe your relationship is not what you want it to be, and maybe some of that's because you're not communicating well, you're not understanding, you can't understand how or why this person thinks the way they do. We work hard on that compassionate understanding of other people and think what's possible with that. So I really want to reach as many people as possible. This is my passion project, this course. Again, I do love all the courses I run. I do get passionate about all of them, but this one in particular, I think is badly needed in society right now. And I've seen the results for myself, the transformational results from the clients who take it. And so I try to keep it as accessible. So even though most of my programs are $2,000 plus, I try to keep the price accessible on this one. So you can join for one payment of $497 or 3 payments of $177. As a fast action bonus, again, I'm a big believer in taking action. If something is in alignment, trust your gut, go with it. If this is the right thing for you, then go with it. And I like to provide as much value as I can. I like to help you with that decision making. I think the universe responds to speed. When we make the decision that's right for us in alignment in the time, then we should do it. And so for those who enroll in the next 2 hours, we do have an additional bonus Q&A call to help you get the most out of this course. This is tentatively scheduled for the evening of the 18th in North America. It will be more midday for those on the other side of the world on Monday. This is where we're going to start that community forming, get to know each other. It's a meet and greet call. It's also how do we get the most value out of the course to help us prep. So you get the 20 empowering video modules, the worksheets, the quizzes, the exercises, and of course, the huge value, those live Q&A calls. We're going to form this caring, non-judgmental community together, really get to know each other. I'm going to guide you through the content personally. I'm going to hold your hand when you need your hand held and help you work through it. And we're going to make sure all your questions are answered. And we're going to do it together as a community. And then the fast action bonus in the next couple hours, that additional Q&A call to meet your fellow participants and get the most value out of this course. If you're interested, you want to check it out, go to awakenmygenius.com. The question on there, it's all recorded, right? So there's a lot of pre-recorded content that's already uploaded, all the main instructional content, and then you'll get recordings of the Q&A calls. Not everybody can make every Q&A. I get that. Time zone differences, busy schedules. So the Q&A calls are also recorded. And one thing to note, the recordings of the Q&A calls, access is limited only to those who join this run of the program. Those Q&A calls will not be given out to people who took it last year. They're not going to be given out to people who took it next year. The recordings of the Q&A calls are limited to the people in this run because I want people to open up and trust one another so that you know that the recordings are only going to be seen by the people in this run, and you don't have to worry about people, seeing the calls later. Can the course be done entirely without the calls? Yes, in fact, there are often people who simply can't make any of the Q&A calls, and I get that. And that's fine. And in fact, I designed the pre-recorded content so that you would get the value out of it if you could not make the calls. If all you do is watch the pre-recorded content, you're going to get these bite-sized chunks organized in a logical manner that go through it piece by piece. It's going to build a foundation to a conclusion for that compassionate self-reflection, that communication with others. You're going to see how I incorporate, again, that hard logic and the stuff. How many hours? Actually, I'm not sure. I haven't counted up the time in all the course. I would say, actually, I'm not sure. It's maybe about 10 hours of content total, maybe less, because it's 20 videos, and there are a couple of longer ones, but most of them are much shorter. So you're very welcome, Ethel. Thank you. Well, the homework is how much do you want to put into it, right? There are worksheets. I don't know in hours terms. There's one worksheet per week to go through. Some people go through the worksheets much faster than others. And I'm not giving grades. I'm not tracking who does the homework and not. You don't have to do the homework if you don't want to. It's up to you. Like any other course, you can get out of it what you put into it. I'm glad you want to, right? Because the worksheets are really going to help, instill it. So I would think most people can get through each worksheet in about an hour each. There's usually one worksheet per week. And in fact, I usually have a bonus call. We call it the worksheet workshop, where we all get together and go through the worksheets together, after you've had a chance to do it. That way you can kind of see, how I go through the worksheets and kind of my thought process there. So again, it's awakenmygenius.com. If you want to check out the page, if you're ready to enroll, you can click the button and we'll take you to the payment options, right? You can choose your payment plan, the single or the 3-pay, whatever works best for you. You can also scroll through the page, see more about what's included, and I put a ton of client testimonials on there, right? Again, a good skeptical thinker would not just take my word for it. A good skeptical thinker would ask for evidence, and the best evidence I can give you are the words of the people who have actually been through it and experienced the transformation themselves. So please take a look at the testimonials on there if you want or need more evidence. That's totally fine. That's why I put them up there, because I want you to see it. And my clients wanted to share those testimonials so that more people would experience the same results that they did.